Okay, I'm back for my morning meeting with you all, and we're back to Abraham Lincoln book. All right, let's find where I left off. Here it is. On March 4th, 1861, Lincoln was inaugurated as the 16th President of the United States. And even during this time of crisis with the Civil War on the horizon, Lincoln held out hope for peace in his inaugural address. Quote, "We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies," unquote. This last-minute appeal failed to stop the approaching war. On April 12, 1861, Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor, South Carolina, was fired upon by the Southern forces. The House-divided crisis that Lincoln had predicted 2 years earlier had come to pass. The Confederate States of America included South Carolina, Georgia, Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, Texas, Louisiana, Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina. Lincoln's presidency proved to be the most difficult in history to the date of 2020, with a term in office dominated by a bloody civil war that cost the nation an estimated 750,000 lives. The picture I'm going to show you is President Lincoln and his cabinet adapting the Emancipation Proclamation. It's a lithograph by Currier and Ives from 1876. Do you see Abraham? All right. We march forth. Even though the Civil War demanded much of Lincoln's time, he made sure that he saw his children. His oldest son, Robert, regularly visited from Harvard, and Willie and Tad were allowed to interrupt meetings whenever they liked. The Lincoln family felt the tragedy of the Civil War in many ways, but was especially struck when on February 20th, 1862, their son, Willie, died. Oh no, they've lost their second son now. It says probably of typhoid fever, and despite the loss of his son, Lincoln had to continue to direct the war and the country. Slavery was a divisive issue, which means that people could not agree. They thought different things, divided. Which seems kind of weird because now I don't think it's a divided issue. But anyway, slavery was a divisive issue that helped propel Lincoln to the White House and thrust the nation into the Civil War. Lincoln maintained that as president, he could not end slavery. But by the summer of 1862, with the war raging on, Lincoln had drafted the Emancipation Proclamation after concluding that as Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces, it was legal for him to free the slaves as a necessary war measure. Lincoln called his cabinet together on July 22nd and read the Emancipation Proclamation to them, and they suggested that Lincoln should wait for the Union victory, so the proclamation did not seem to be a desperative move by a losing army. Later that year, on September 17, 1862, the bloodiest single day of the Civil War, Union General George B. McClellan met Robert E. Lee's Confederate forces at Antietam Creek near Sharpsburg, Maryland, and drove Lee back into Virginia. This was the victory that Lincoln was waiting for, and on September 22nd, he issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. The final proclamation was signed and took effect on January 1st, 1863. Now, on November 2nd, 1863, Lincoln received an invitation to give a speech to the dedication of a military cemetery at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, to honor those who had died at the July 1st through the 3rd, 1863 battle. At Gettysburg, 51,000 soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured, making it the bloodiest battle of the Civil War. On November 19, 1863, following a 2-hour speech from the featured speaker, Edward Everett, Lincoln rose and gave his brief Gettysburg address, in which he told the audience that the United States was a nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. He then called for a new birth of freedom. Because of the war, Lincoln was constantly reminded of death. And when he learned that an Illinois friend had been killed in the battle, he wrote a letter to the friend's daughter, Fanny McCullough. Quote, "Sorrow comes to all," he wrote, "and to the young it comes with bitterest agony. The memory of your dear father will yet be a sad, sweet feeling in your heart." Unquote. Lincoln protected life wherever he could. His compassion for soldiers condemned to death for desertion, falling asleep at their posts, or other minor offenses is well known. In 1863, Lincoln's secretary, John Hay, wrote about Lincoln's aversion to executions in his diary, quote, "Cases of cowardice he was specially averse to punishing with death. He said it would frighten the poor devils too terribly to shoot them," unquote. Here I'm going to show you this picture of Lincoln delivering his Gettysburg Address on November 19, 1863. It's a lithograph from 1905. Despite the stress and sacrifice of office, Lincoln was interested in retaining the presidency for another term, and he ran for re-election in 1864. Lincoln's opponent in the election was General McClellan. McClellan did not feel the ending of slavery was important, and his party concluded that the war was an absolute failure. McClellan's popularity also came at a time when Lincoln's support was faltering. Newspapers were critical of the cost of the war and accused Abraham Lincoln of not caring about the loss of life and the nation's dire situation. But we know that wasn't true. It made him very sad. By August 1864, Lincoln's political insiders advised him that his re-election was in jeopardy. One Republican leader wrote, "I have told Mr. Lincoln that this re-election was an impossibility," end quote. Several events helped turn the tide for Abraham Lincoln in his quest to retain the presidency. One of the most important was General Sherman's military capture of Atlanta. This picture is President Lincoln is greeted by Union soldiers and freedmen in Virginia, March 1865. And this picture is a photograph by Alexander Gardner. It was taken November 8th, 1863, 11 days before he delivered the Gettysburg Address. And I think that's probably the most famous image of Abraham Lincoln. That's the one that pops in my mind anyway. Well, the results of the election brought Abraham Lincoln 55% of the popular vote, and to George B. McClellan's 45%. And by the time Lincoln gave his second inaugural address on March 4th, 1865, the Union victory was all but assured, and Lincoln used the inaugural address to remind all that the war was fought over slavery. Quote, "These slaves constituted a peculiar and powerful interest. All knew that this interest was somehow the cause of the war," unquote. But he also used this moment to begin to reunite nations by saying the country should act, quote, "with malice toward none, with charity for all." This picture is oh, wait, I'm not ready for this one. Now that Lincoln had guided the country through the Civil War, he began to concentrate on repairing the nation and life with his family. On April 14th, 1865, he took his wife Mary on a carriage ride and talked of their son Willie, who had died 3 years earlier. They talked of their plans for the future and when they could perhaps travel and return to the quiet of their Springfield, Illinois home. Mary recalled that Lincoln seemed more cheerful than he had been,